Today, we have an amazing presentation today. First, let me introduce you to our speaker. Patti Rendon, Patricia Rendon, became Columbus Organization's Executive Director. They handle Waiver Support Coordination, and she became the president in Florida in 2020. She has over 30 years experience from coast to coast, from her earliest work in San Francisco, helping individuals acquire the ability to travel and work, to her leadership with USF Best Buddies International Chapter, the Florida Advocacy and Coordination Team, the Alameda ARC, Lee County Mental Health, and Pinellas ARC. She's dedicated her life and career to advocating and partnering and coordinating services for people with disabilities and in need. So this is very exciting to have her here. When she was appointed to the Columbus organization, she made it clear that the goal of Waiver Support Coordinators is to stand alongside, cheer their triumph, and wipe their tears as they build their own independent lives. She has made their success dependent on the individual's success. If you have operational staff, we are taping this so you can share later with them throughout the ARC of Florida and other providers as well. This is a service we do to improve the quality of advocacy for all providers. Patti will focus on the different roles, including Waiver Support Coordinators, family, with a focus on providers on how they can have a positive impact on the SANS process. Again, it will focus on providers' ability to impact the SANS process to the benefit of our clients. There'll be an opportunity for questions during the presentation. You can raise your hand, you can put something in the chat, or you can just speak if you see a gap in talking. But Patti, thank you for being there. I just want to mention also, she's an elected official. She's on the school board in Hillsborough County. She was elected last year and just committed her life to helping people. So Patti, if you could help us.
Okay, we're good?
Yep.
So what is a SANS? I wanted to pull directly from 393.063 and exactly where APD connects and where we actually define what a SANS means. SANS is an additional need for medical necessity services, which would plan for the health and safety of a client. The client's caregiver is unable to provide care, or the public is in serious risk if not met. The term also includes services to meet the individual's needs, and client requires in order to maintain the least restrictive setting, including but not limited to employment services and transportation services. The agency provides additional funding only after determination of the client's allocated amount and after the WC has documented the availability of non-waiver resources on a verification of eligibility service form. I think sometimes that is where we come into difficulty. There's situations where providers feel that there's an increased need for a service level. And so, for example, let's say ResHab, very commonly, there's an increase in client's behavior or increase in client needs, and yet the provider then turns around and requests an increase in that funding. However, the coordinator then has to justify that there is still the level of need for the SANS. Is the caregiver unable to provide care? Is it a risk to the community or the health and safety of the individual? And then have they ruled out all other ways in which their allocation or their budget already approved can meet those needs? The Waiver Support Coordinator has to complete a verification of eligibility form in which they have to determine have those needs that could have been met in other resources, whether that's Medicare, whether that's outside natural resources, whether it's a family member. Could they decline maybe companion services or reduce personal supports, maybe reduce ADT to do some other things? So they have to show that they have gone through and utilized all possible resources, funded or non-funded, any other kind of naturals before they submit a SANS. and they have to document on the verification of eligibility form. I think that's where some of the controversy comes in, because providers are then asked on multiple occasions, well, have you tried this? Or have you done X? Or do you see a different avenue in which we could do? Or is there a home health agency that could provide it, especially when an individual, let's say, comes out of the hospital and goes back into a group home? Well, the coordinator is responsible to making sure they have reviewed all natural resources prior to requesting additional funding. So they have to go through home health agencies. They have to go through and make sure Medicare has been reviewed and some things like that. However, in many cases, the family would just prefer the residential provider to get an increase in their level of funding to provide additional staff during that recovery period. Yet the coordinator just can't do that. They have to make sure that there's a determination in which that's already been done, where the natural resources have already been eliminated. So that's one area in which we do that. You know, our primary goal in this training is we're going to identify when a SANS is completed by the WSC, what is included when a SANS is completed, and what the role, excuse me one second. I'm so sorry, someone came by. What's included in a SANS and what is the role of the provider with a SANS? When should a SANS be completed and how long does it take to get it approved? Can services be paid when a SANS is in process? And then any questions and follow-up. We want to make sure that we're covering all the needs of both the providers and the coordinator. When does a SANS need to be completed? According to the rule, a documented history of significant or potentially life-threatening behaviors, such as a recent attempt at suicide, arson, non-consensual sexual behavior, self-injurious behavior require medical attention, dementia, age-related behaviors, or present significant health and safety risks. A complex medical condition that requires active intervention by a licensed nurse or ongoing basis that cannot be taught or delegated to a non-licensed person, a need for total assistance or activities of daily living, such as eating, bathing, toileting, grooming, dressing, personal hygiene, lifting, transferring, or ambulation, permanent or long-term loss of incapacitated of a caregiver, loss of services otherwise under a state Medicaid plan or through the school system due to change of age, significant decline in medical, behavioral, or functioning status, lack of a meaningful day activity needed to foster mental health, prevent progression, or engage in meaningful community life or activities. One or more of the situations described in 65G 1.047, crisis status criteria, risk of abuse, neglect, exploitation, or abandonment that can be mitigated by waiver services. One of the things that I find to be where this is where we have a discrepancy in both regions and coordinators. A provider may request a SANS request or an increase in funding because they themselves are having to add additional staffing to meet the needs of an individual. They see a regression in the physical condition of an individual, or they see an increase in behaviors of an individual. So they then request a SANS from the coordinator. They don't directly request a SANS, but they request an increase in maybe a res-hab level, maybe moving from moderate to intensive. So then the coordinator comes back and says, wait a minute, I need more documentation. I need you to write something up. And the residential provider says, well, no, we have an increase in this. Three things need to match: the provider's documentation, the coordinator's documentation, and the QSI need to all coincide, making sure they show where there's been some kind of change in the individual's status, whether that's their physical status, their functioning status, or their behavioring status. If we cannot show a change through all three documentations, and in the case of behavior, also including graphs and behavioral information from your behavior analyst, then a SANS will be rejected or will not be submitted. The three parts documentation, where a provider documentation, the coordinator documentation, and the QSI documentation all being aligned, is critical when the SANS is going to be submitted and during the SANS process. I want to remind everyone on the call that the QSI, or the questionable situational instrument, is the state's mandated assessment. The state has defined that tool as being the assessment tool demonstrating the needs of the individual, demonstrating the level of care of an individual. If an individual shows a significant change in their physical, behavioral, or functioning status, then that may show a need in the change of their funding criteria. So if at any point in time we're going to need to look for a SANS process, we are going to need to make sure that that QSI is updated, showing the most accurate and current needs of the individual. That will then show where this change in life circumstance has occurred. Anyone have any questions on that as we go along? I think is there a question in the chat? Oh, we got that one. Is there any other questions in the chat or anywhere else? Okay.
I got a question just to bring up as it comes up later, where it seems like there's times around the state that they're lowering the iBudget, or, I mean, it seems like you're talking about when you need more, but it seems like independent of us, they're lowering it.
Yes.
The amount of supports. And,
yes.
And so that's kind of like what I'm hearing from the field.
You are correct. And so up until this last month, we had rolling budget reviews, right? So all of a sudden somebody would go, look, it's been 3 years. We're going to update the QSI and we're going to review the algorithm. We had rolling algorithm reviews. And at the time they did a rolling algorithm review, they would send out to the coordinator, and a lot of times they would just throw it in the notes section. And so the coordinator may or may not see it. They don't put an alert note to it. And they would say, there's been a change in the algorithm. Does this meet the individual's need or not? Because if the algorithm changes, and that even though, let's say the algorithm was at $20,000, the individual 3 years ago, a coordinator did a SANS and recognized the budget needed to be $35,000. Well, they do a new algorithm review in June of 2023, and they now show the algorithm at $22,000, but the budget is still at $33,000. That coordinator has to go through the entire SANS process again, even though at $35,000, that SANS process was done 3 years ago, which means every single service that that individual gets is being reviewed at that time. In many cases, a waiver support coordinator will do that SANS process without a provider even knowing it's being done. And the reason is because all the coordinator needs is the provider documentation over the course of either quarter or 12 months. So that coordinator will just submit that provider documentation when they submit the SANS request. Next thing you know, you get an authorization that reduces that client's budget and that client's allocation and SANS to you, because you had no idea that a SANS was being done. Now, last month, a select group of waiver support coordinators met with Director Hatch, and they made a commitment not to be doing rolling algorithm reviews. So they are only going to do them when there's a change in either the function, behavioral, or physical needs of an individual, and that needs to be done, or when a QSI is reviewed. They're not just going to be doing rolling algorithms. So that should help somewhat. But it does bring a good point in that as providers, and now as more providers are getting into iConnect, it's even more critical. Your documentation needs to be in line with both the QSI and the support plan. Because your documentation is 50% or 33%, either way you want to look at it. It's a significant amount of justification of the consumer's needs. It is critical that providers recognize their documentation is between 33 and 50% of the justification of a service. What is included in a SANS? All documentation that is documented in the Coverage and Limitations Handbook under best practices will be submitted for each individual, each service that is being provided. Now, if we're only requesting an increase in residential habilitation, but the individual has behavioral services, ADT services, transportation services, behavioral services, and speech services, they are going to submit documentation for all services, even though only one service is being requested to be increased. The SANS process will review all services, not just the service that's being requested. Why is that critically important? If currently you are under a 1-to-5 ratio at the ADT, but you're requesting an increase from moderate to extensive 1 in ResHab, there is a disconnect between those two services. And the SANS reviewer is looking at the documentation of both the ADT and the ResHab to making sure they're both cohesive to meeting the needs of the individual. If the ResHab is at an extensive 1, they're looking to see that the ADT is at a 1-to-3 ratio. If they're not the same, and that is looked at through the handbook as well, then they're looking at that it's a provider implementation of the service and not a medical necessity need of a service. Anybody have a question on that?
Can you explain that a bit clearer? What exactly are you saying?
So, for example, if an individual is meeting the needs of a extensive 1 criteria for a residential provider, that means that individual has either medical needs or physical needs that require maybe 2-person transfers, or they have behavioral needs that are at least maybe they've had 3 Baker Acts over the course of 6 months, or they have property destruction over $1,500, or they have at least a minimum of 3 Baker Acts over the course of 12 months. If that residential provider needs an extensive 1 level of services and rate because they have an intervention of a behavior plan or their staff ratio needs to meet that need, then the ADT should be at a 1-to-3. Because that would meet the same criteria.
I have a question regarding that.
Yep.
Oftentimes, I'm sorry, I'm the day services manager for the Arc Nature Coast.
Yep.
So oftentimes we'll see individuals who behave a certain way in their residential setting and then a different way in their day program setting. For example, the demands aren't the same as they are in residential. Like, you need to take a shower, you need to do this, but we don't have those kinds of demands at the residential, at the day program setting. So they may display behaviors at home, but not at program.
Right. But cohesively, those 2 programs need to be working with the behavior analysts, making sure that they're demonstrating that they're showing probes, that they're showing areas in which the day program do have demands, or that the behavior plan is being implemented at either place so that the behaviors are still occurring, but the implementation of the service and you guys providing that intervention is causing the data to be skewed. You've got to make sure that link is the behavior analyst and their documentation that are linking the two programs together, still showing the need and the behavioral needs of the two individuals, because you should still have demands at the ADT. The demands may just be different. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, I'll give an example. This wasn't at the ARC. This is my previous employer. We had an individual who was a 1-to-1 in his home because of behaviors. And he was completely fine at day program.
They will question that on the SANS and they will not approve.
Okay.
Because of the fact that the individual doesn't change from environment to environment if it is a behavioral.
But they do change.
No, the implementation may change.
The implementation of what?
The behavior plan. Maybe there's not a need of a behavior plan. Why would there be a need of a behavior plan at the home and not the day program? If it is a behavior, if it is based on their disability and they, that they don't have control of that behavior or their disability is causing it, the disability doesn't change from environment to environment. And remember, we're providing intervention based upon disability.
Sure. So let me throw one thing in.
Sure.
I know a little bit too much about behavior analysis, so I won't get into that, but multiple baseline across conditions is well known. That you have behavior in one area and not in another. It's fairly common, actually. Research goes back to the 60s on that.
Understand.
So, but what I want to throw in is this. I've been at this a while.
Right.
And I've done a lot of advocacy for people. Because when the system's too reluctant to provide needed services, I see that as neglect and exploitation.
Absolutely.
So for instance, I've dealt with people that have profound ID.
Right.
On minimal cost plans.
Absolutely.
Okay. So these folks need assistance in every single life area. So their QSIs will be 5s. Someone with profound or severe IDD, it's a basic fact in the literature and in any sort of assessment done that there's not an area where they don't need full assistance. Profound ID is only about 3% of the population or less. It's a very severe condition. So when you have levels of rehab that step up with levels of need, and you have medical documentation that this person falls in the 2% range of severe disability, yet they're funded at a minimal. It just seems to disregard the medical community, disregard everything that's known about IDD for years and years and years. And my question to you, if you can weave this in a little bit, what I found in the process is, because I'm all with you on the data. If you don't have data, you're in big trouble.
Right.
I'll give you an example of where you can have two different levels of behavior where it's not implementation. And that would be if someone is in a home, this is just a side comment, if someone's in a home and you have a sexual predator and there's people that they cannot predate against in that home because they're larger or they're a threat to them. Okay, but at the day program, they will. That's very, very common. And if that's not recognized and that's seen as a implementation error, that's just a deadly mistake against all evidence. But
see, here's where they came in with, this is where they corrected that, right?
Yeah.
So here's where the correction of that goes in. And this is where maybe there's a disconnect when I say of a documentation or implementation error.
Yeah.
When it comes to individuals, for example, behavior, let's say the reason that they've got an extensive one is because of multiple Baker Acts over 6 months. They've had 3 Baker Acts in 6 months. At the end of the day, we have to make sure that both the ADT and the group home are both on the same level of intervention.
Absolutely.
And that's what I'm saying. When it comes to, for example, the sexual predator situation, no matter whether that is occurring at the group home or occurring at the ADT, we have to make sure that we are putting in place a plan to avoid that circumstance or that situation occurring at both the ADT and the group home. What happens and what I see happen and where we get into this disconnect is, for example, the ADT, it happens more at the ADT than the group home. The actual ADT itself will not document where the intervention is or not document how they show where they're moving in different areas. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Or they don't document where, how they're providing that support to the individual or the other individual to remain safe. They lack how they organize their day to keep that person safe, where the group home over documents and shows in everything because they implement that safety plan to a T. And because there's that disconnect, now again, when it's more of a sexual predator, when there's a disconnect, the SANS will question it. But when it's behaviors, they won't question it, and they'll just reduce the residential for the ADT documentation. And that's where the problem comes in. Right. I see it more on the ADT side than I see on the residential side.
Right. So you could end up with a residential program with someone with a very serious problem that they're dealing with. They're going to another provider for the day program. That is not doing their job. And then the provider that's doing their job, their funding is reduced.
Yes, that's exactly what's happened. And you see that. This is where you saw those rolling algorithms and you saw the decrease because all the provider documentation were not cohesive. They weren't all speaking the same language. Right. And well, I'm going to shut up here because I want to get this other thing in. Then I won't talk anymore because you're wonderful and you know your stuff, and I like that. If I'll say this, if that's happening, if you have a serious behavior like that one provider is taking care of and one is not, instead of this, and I'm not saying you're doing this, you're not, instead of actually punishing that provider and putting that client at risk. The provider that's not doing it should be looked into and there should be an investigation. Hands down. That is extremely scary to me. Right. And it rings of exploitation. So it does and again, my apologies for interrupting, where we have to, what I want to make sure that we all understand, and I know Alan is doing this across the board with ARCs and our partners, is that we are working on making sure everybody understands and identifies the handbook and best practices and starts utilizing the QSI and the support plan so there's a cohesiveness that everybody is giving the same message. Many times, especially when it comes to personal supports, ADTs, outside providers, I see it in our supported living as well. Employment, not so much. Residential, they've gotten a lot better, but all other services where they'll just document, for example, an ADT, because it's a daily documentation, they will make simple comments of, today we did A, B, C, and D, enjoyed individuals socialize with their people. Right. That gives no direct accountability to the handbook or the QSI or the goals. Of course. So this is absolutely. And, you know, when I work with waiver support coordinators, when we do team meetings, I'm a big team meeting person. If you're going to get something done, do a team meeting, partner with that waiver support coordinator. That is absolutely critical. I completely agree with that. I just want to throw in this one thing. What I found that's mucking this up, even when everyone is cooperating, you have great data, you're showing great need with a great disparity in level of need and what the current funding is. What happens is you get everything together and then the QSI is thrown out, everything else is thrown out, and they go to the levels of ResHab descriptors. And what they've redefined is total care and general supervision. So it doesn't matter how much documentation you have, because in the end,
what can be said, like I'm using the extreme example, someone with profound or severe ID, and they need a lot of care. And if you
absolutely.
have serious supervision, that person's going to get hurt. They're going to slip in the shower. Bad things are going to happen. And you need, that person's extremely vulnerable. So what they do now is they say, well, can that person do anything to help? Anything at all, including just looking at you and trying not to resist? Well, that means they're not total care. So you can have someone with shaken baby syndrome in a wheelchair that's unable to move, but if they can look at you, they're not total care anymore. And then what they say is, because they're not total care, everything's covered under general supervision. So what it does to the levels of rehab care, which go up to meet need, it flattens it out by changing that definition of total care and general supervision. So
I'll be honest with you, when I've seen those circumstances and I really do a deep dive in the packet, I see more of a discrepancy than I see APD coming back on those strains. Because it seems to be they'll find a very small discrepancy somewhere along the line, or someone that one of the players has not been on the same level, and they'll pull from that. For example, they'll pull from that same person went and volunteered at Walmart, right? And they'll take it and they'll run with it because they're like, well, how can they do that if they were doing this? So we've got to really pay attention. Now, I'm saying this to individual provider agencies that are doing the work, right? I think the executive directors, everybody else, we are the ones fighting in Tallahassee directly to have that language changed. But when I'm talking to you guys, I'm talking about where we're at with documentation. We have to do a review and make sure of that. The other half of us need to continue to fight the fight with ACA to make sure that we are demonstrating and clearly defining that within the rate table and within the handbook. That's where the discrepancy has to be. And I myself, I've talked to Alan about this. I'm trying to get a meeting with the director of ACA regarding all of APD and stuff in general. We need to eliminate all of this. The changing of coordinators is killing the system. The fact that people have like 10 coordinators in a year is killing the system. And APD has set that up for failure. So that is a huge problem, and we have to scale that back. We've got to eliminate a lot treating provider numbers so that it's only a QO, just like you guys do with your agency. So you hire staff. We've got to make that change. We've got to make sure that ACA understands the definitions of the handbook are limiting and are just too constraining for funding sources. So yes, we've got to make sure that all works, and I'm not going against that. So let me go back and let's move through. The bottom line when it comes to what's included in a SANS is really critical that all providers are familiar with this documentation. In many cases, providers are eliminated or feel they're eliminated from both the QSI and the eligibility of verification of services. They need to make sure that they are following, when they're doing their documentation, the best practices from the back of the handbook. When I originally did this training, and I believe Deanna will send it out again if there's anyone new to the training, I sent out a copy of the handbook, a copy of best practices, and making sure that you make sure that if you get a support plan that does not detail the QSI to your standards, contact that WSC and get it involved again. The more of you that are getting access to iConnect, the more you have direct connect to the QSI. However, that support plan is going to be the primary resource. So make sure you get the details from that QSI in that support plan. Do not accept anything less, because that's where you need to make sure you're pulling out of in your documentation.
Patti, quick question.
Yes.
I just want to go back to what Mark was talking about. When you have one provider that has them at a higher level than the other provider, and it's really because the provider that hasn't been documenting everything, they just don't have the evidence to fund it, the one that's doing it right. why wouldn't they, instead of saying there's no evidence on the one that's not providing it, so that's the one we're going with, why wouldn't they look at both and just say who's right and choose that one?
Because of the fact you have
like
to remember this is Medicaid billing.
It seems like if it's person-centered, though, you would put the other person on a corrective action plan if they got it wrong because they weren't documenting, than to just lower it. I mean, that's just from a layperson's view.
Well, we see it as being wrong. ACA sees it as this provider provided this service and billed for it, and here's their backup. So they are saying that they were truthful in their documentation, just like the other provider was. So they're not saying a provider or that provider is right or wrong. Once you submit it to ACA, they believe that it would be a federal offense if they were not doing it correctly. So ACA doesn't show it that same, they don't view it that same way.
So here's what I see, though, and Mark, you correct me if I'm wrong on this, because you're in the field actually doing this stuff, that the one who was billing more because they were meeting the services, all of a sudden they're running a deficit because they have to either get rid of the services or continue to provide them at the higher rate. Right. And I think that's where some of the challenges are coming around the state, where providers may be worried. Some providers have even been told to give 30-day notice then.
I would 100% tell a family, I would tell a provider that, because of the fact that here's where that comes in. Where that comes in is if the coordinator is unwilling to do a SANS request because they don't believe they have the documentation, by the provider providing a 30-day notice, you now automatically meet the criteria of a SANS, because the health and safety and the homelessness, possible homelessness, meets a SANS criteria. That's why a coordinator will tell you if you give a 30 day.
Start again. The process would start again for a new SANS once they downgrade it?
No. If they downgrade it, you have to complete a new SANS if you want to go back. Once their decision has come down, you the individual can either appeal the decision, and if they appeal it within 30 days, the service remains intact as it was prior to the SANS decision, or you request a new SANS.
Well, when you say appeal it, who has the right of appeal?
The individual.
It's only the client, right?
Or the guardian.
Or the guardian, yeah, whoever has decision-making authority.
Correct.
Okay.
Meanwhile, and you know if there's a decision from a SANS that they have that time.
The scary part about this is, in the meantime, there's a person with needs, and people are arguing endlessly over process.
Correct.
And federal rule and all of this stuff. And I agree with you. It's just that much more reason why we really need to cooperate, you know. But that it's not the total answer. It's what we need to do to adapt, right? So it's scary for providers, because when we're in this situation and we know someone's got a very serious problem, and it takes a year to try to get through something. If anything goes wrong in the meantime, there's investigations, there's all sorts of stuff that happens. And right now, when I'm most concerned about people that have severe behavior and people with profound and severe, because they're the most vulnerable.
Correct.
So what happens is the person comes up against this process, which is huge. And the probability of a group of 12 people all being in perfect sync when they're all from different providers is about 0. So the odds are already stacked against the client. And then if a 30-day notice is given, even if you go to a statewide search, there's no providers that'll pick them up.
No.
And people are suffering. That's my biggest concern. So you're saying in the meantime, until maybe something can be done at a higher level, we just really need to band together and cooperate and communicate and make sure that our documentation is, because I agree, when you're doing a daily note or you're making a documentation, if you're not talking about something that's in the support plan and in the implementation plan, you might as well be drawing smiley faces.
Correct. And making sure that when you are in cohesiveness with your coordinator, but again, the problem is your coordinators are either dropping or changing so frequently that relationship is not being kept as strongly as it has in the past. Absolutely. So consequently, we want to make sure that we provide every effort possible to make sure that support plan is maintained. Do not wait. Make sure you have support plans on time. If you go longer than a week and you've asked 3 times for a coordinator, you've got to contact your regional staff. You have to. Also, if you make sure you put things in writing, assign who's going to be communicating that. Many providers, especially within the ARC community and partner communities, have caseworkers within your agencies. Make sure they are in writing communicating with their coordinators to making sure they're getting that documentation to them on time and subsequently getting it from the coordinator on time. If they're not, you don't wait. If you have a need for an increase of rate, that coordinator can request the increase of rate and get it approved and then do the SANS request subsequently after that. But ask for proof that that SANS was submitted. Critically important.
Right.
They can copy you on an email. When they submit the provider documentation, attach the SANS, they can attach you to that note in iConnect. Make sure that you are included so that you know that, great, I know I now have a service authorization that's going to go, let's say we had an increased rehab from a moderate to an extensive 2. Well, they did that. Now we've only got funding through December of 2023. That's where I know my service authorization ends. Now I want to make sure that that coordinator went in and completed the SANS. That's
right.
A hole and a gap that I see not happening sometimes.
Now that's extremely interesting because I remember that happening several times. I can't remember it very recently, but when there's something big that happens, and there's a cost plan increase prior to the SAN to bridge that gap, what's the criterion for that to happen?
Same thing. Well, if it meets the criteria that we need to increase the rate, it all stays the same. You've got the same reasoning you're going to do it, but we've run out of money, so we have to do a SANS because we're jeopardizing the health and safety. But the reason that we increase the increase still has to be the same. There has to be a significant change, whether it's behavioral, physical, or functional. You have to still have a significant change. Maybe lost a caregiver, right? That's when our PCAs go up. Maybe there was a medical issue where the individual is now coming out of a hospital and has significant additional needs that they've got to have much more needs in a home, right?
But does there have to be money already in the iBudget there to cover that?
You can do that initially. So you get the increase in service approved, but it doesn't last for the entire cost plan.
But it's necessary. Is it a necessary condition for that circumstance to happen that there's already enough money in the iBudget?
Or you take from others. So for example, let's say you recognize that the individual has now gone from a walker to a wheelchair. That's a significant need that would change their level of care, both at the ADT and at the group home, right? So coordinator can go in, request the increase maybe from a 1 to 5 to a 1 to 3 at ADT. And they can go from maybe a moderate to an extensive 1, because now we're requiring 2-person transfers. So we can do that change, right? So now we've got an increase in that. We change the cost plan to stop the moderate, stop the 1 to 5, and we put in 1 to 3, and we put in extensive 1. But our money only goes to the end of February. So your new authorization,
you're using the iBudget, the allocation faster.
Correct. So now you've got a service authorization that ends February 28th, right?
Yeah.
Now you are relying on that coordinator to have done that SANS.
I got it.
A minimum of 60 days before your money runs out. In most cases, you have no idea if they did it or they didn't.
Well, and I'll tell you what's scary about that is I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm a little bit concerned when it gets to the higher level. There's too much subjectivity involved. I mean, I have people that are blind in wheelchairs and they're denied an extensive 1. I mean, wheelchairs don't matter, blindness doesn't matter. In a lot of cases, it's getting really tough out there right now. Really.
Then Mark, I will tell you, if that happens, I need to review what that coordinator set up, because I'm telling you, we've got it. There's a disconnect.
Fair.
There's a disconnect.
That's fair.
Is that something, Patty, that would go to the ombudsman if it's so extreme? And
yes. Well, first of all, there's a disconnect somewhere. In my 30 years, I will say that over the course of the last 5, that is one thing I've seen APD improve immensely, is their decisions based upon the handbook. And you, Mark, are telling me something that would not meet handbook, that would be in handbook criteria, should not be denied. So there's a disconnect somewhere within those processes that we need to make sure that we review those individual cases. But that is one thing I have actually seen do better, where APD is actually making decisions better to the handbook and not being so subjective.
I know that we're running low on time and you still have 5 slides.
All right,
so I'll move a little faster. There's nothing you want to really hit on ahead of time. I know we'll probably have to do this again sometime.
That's okay. So again, let's make sure we understand how significant the provider's role is in this. When I say best practice provider documentation, QSI support plan, those are your 3 largest amount of documentation that's going to be in your SANS. Providers have just as much of documentation as the coordinator. Providers' monthly, quarterly documentation must be current, accurate, and relate directly to the support plan, the QSI. Make sure you are in communication with your WSC on a regular basis. Make sure that the way in which you structure your programs have a direct link in communication with your coordinator. If that is when said coordinator signs into your program, you attach and make sure they know the communication. Educate your group leaders, educate your caseworkers to make sure they're having good communication with their coordinators. If they don't see a coordinator, you make sure they're reaching out to the lead in that QO, making sure that coordinator is following through. Monitoring your service authorizations is critical. If you see a service authorization and sometimes you don't get a copy of it, but your billing person sees a change in the end date, make sure they are looking for that. They're looking for that end date every month when they bill. Making sure that your caseworkers or whoever's receiving your authorizations, making sure they go to the end of the year. If they don't, there should have been a SANS completed. Your billing person are critical because they may see an end date change when they go to bill, but you never received a change in service authorization. That is a trigger that a SANS needs to be done, and you need to make sure that coordinator did it. That's one of those where they move the money, but you never got a new service authorization. And all of a sudden you're like, why can't I bill? It's March 1st. Now you're going to be looking for general revenue dollars because that coordinator didn't do what they were supposed to do. So that billing person needs to make sure every time they go to bill, their authorization that they see in the web portal goes all the way to the end of the year. Something that we've not had to tell providers to keep monitoring. Make sure they're monitoring that.
But one more thing really quick, the disconnect that I've seen sometimes when we have a real severe example and it's denied, because they go back to the levels of res have description and they say, well, the person doesn't have bed sores. They haven't tried to commit suicide. Okay. Bed sores is a provider neglect.
Absolutely.
So they don't have bed sores. They haven't committed suicide and they don't have a G tube. So you're denied because it has to meet all of the preponderance.
It doesn't have to meet all 3. There's a way in which you can review it and you can monitor, especially if you are quoting your documentation to the QSI. Okay. It is critical. That QSI is the state mandated assessment approved by ACA. That is going to be your benchmark to making sure. And I know that it's a way in which we're all documenting, but your coordinator has to be doing it the same way when they're doing the review and their support plan too. They've got to show those medical needs and that documentation of that, especially through evacuation, especially through hurricane, especially health and safety. We've got to make sure that we're demonstrating that. In some cases, I've actually had a res hab provider put out a schedule of where the staff needs to hit and how they have to have 2 people on to meet the needs of that individual, because that justifies that and puts it right in criteria. So it's all in which getting creative and making sure we're showing that justification.
Okay, thank you.
Submitting a SANS is not sent anything, and all I can do is wait, right? No, that is not the case. A coordinator can do many things while they are in process of a SANS. If a coordinator should be changing, if there's a need for a res hab level, that should be changed prior to a SANS request. You don't wait for a SANS to get it. If there's a need for a change in res hab level, you should be able to have it changed before you get a SANS approval. Because the same criteria approves. Submit that. The coordinator should submit that, reduce it, and then do the SANS. They should be pulling from the back of the cost plan to put that service in place. That's why it's a crisis. Once that service is in place, the cost plan goes to approved status, the SANS is submitted.
You think inexperienced waiver support coordinators are scared to do that because they might run out of money and not have successful
because they
plan?
don't know. They think they do. Once they do the SANS, then they've got upheaval of the, they have to have an approved cost plan to submit a SANS because it's got to show all the numbers. So pull that money back. Now, the only time in which you can't pull money back is, say, June. There's no money to pull it back. Okay? There's no money to pull it back. However, there should be a communication with the regional staff, because if there's a crisis and you need that, you may need to go to a daily rate for that service and do a SANS. You got to be in communication. Everybody has got to get creative and talk about it. If you can't move money, there really should never be a time you can't move money, because unless it's June, you should be able to move money, because you can move all the services for June and put them in May. And then you get your regional deputy ROM to push the SANS and make it a rush. They have the ability to do that. You don't want to do that all the time. It's kind of like having the ROM cell phone number. They'll give it to you if you respect it. The same thing applies for a rush of a SANS. You can't do it all the time. If you're doing it because the provider or the coordinator didn't do things in a proper time frame, they're not going to rush it for you. But if they're doing it because it's a true emergency and the client has gone into crisis and we need that done immediately to suffice that, they can do it. They can move money from June to May and they rush the SANS. So I put a timeline up here just to give you an idea. If a res hab provider requests in writing an increase of a SANS on the 15th, SANS is submitted on the 1st. Right now, there's times in which the coordinator has to hunt down documentation. And in some cases, they've got to tell that provider, look at your documentation. Make sure your documentation, especially with personal supports, especially with ADTs, that documentation really has got to have a beef and an uplift. Behavior seems to be okay. Res hab is doing a much better job. And I think, Mark, that's because res hab providers have been hit so hard in that provider documentation with those markers. So I think I've seen a really big increase in the provider documentation and a big change in that. But our ADTs, our companions, our all of those things that we're not. So there may be a need. The other thing, if there's a request for an increase of the ADT, the res hab provider may have no idea that their documentation is being submitted. So it does take some time, right? Or if the res hab provider submits that document, submits the request in writing, coordinator has all the documentation, they submit it. If it shouldn't take 15 days, it should take no more than 7 business days. I mean, 7 days, 5 working days. It should take no more than 7, but let's say it does. On the 25th, that SANS review can submit additional documentation, but they request it via iConnect on a client page and they don't see it because they don't make it an alert. Additional documentation is submitted by to APD through the coordinator Again, it's 7 days. They do have 7 days to submit that additional documentation.
How will they see it if it's not an alert? I mean, are you expected to go to that page every day?
Yes, they expect providers and coordinators to go to pages every day.
Okay.
They are expecting, if once providers are in iConnect, just like coordinators, they're expecting you to log in and review all of your notes every day. But sometimes if they just, let's say a reviewer just uploads it into notes and doesn't attach the coordinator's name, or the coordinator's changed, right, in between, or it's submitted under a, like if a coordinator doesn't have their treating provider number yet, then that SANS is submitted under a mentor and not the actual coordinator. So that mentor may not recognize that client as one of their own. It's because it's with the coordinator that's being mentored, which is, again, another reason that I'm advocating for coordinators not to have treating provider numbers and have direct access as soon as they're hired, like a provider would be, an employee would be. Right now, it takes a coordinator anywhere up to 6 months and sometimes 9 months to actually get in under their name in iConnect, because APD will not put them in without a treating provider number. But you could hire an ADT staff now that when they get in now in the month of August and we go in iConnect with ADT staff, they can automatically get into iConnect. So you could have a layer of people not seeing it. So it's a problem, which is another reason I'm advocating for them to be a simpler system. If in January now, provider documentation was submitted on November 2nd, as of January 2nd, you can invoke the Wheaton rule. In that case, if the client evokes the Wheaton rule, you can get them to approve services as they stand and as the SANS request. But it is 60 days from the time the final documentation was submitted.
And I would assume the Wheaton rule is based on a case that was litigated called Wheaton. Okay.
Correct. That SANS cannot sit there longer than 60 days completed. I remind you, they will fight you to making sure. So the better the documentation is and the better the SANS is submitted from the beginning is always better. Now, you've got to make sure during that SANS process, your service authorization does not end. I would recommend 15 days before that service authorization ends, you are putting in writing to that coordinator a request for general revenue funds. And I would copy the deputy ROM on it or the lead of waiver unit at the local level. The regional local for the waiver lead, I would copy them on that request, the coordinator. If you happen to know the coordinator's liaison, you can put them in there. But at a minimum, the waiver lead for that region. Do not wait. Do not take their word for it. If they've not provided you an authorization prior to it ending, and an IFS authorization is just as good as an iBudget authorization. But if you have nothing after that authorization ends, you are not guaranteed a payment. Do not let it ever end.
Great. I know the last slide is the summary. Is there any last words you want to leave? Oh, that wasn't the last slide. Go ahead.
No, but here's a good one. At the end of the day, when can services be paid while SANS? Communication, making sure if you are looking, making sure your payment and things, communication is key. Your providers, WSC, family and individuals need to communicate together, monitor your funding, get it in writing, always have things in writing. IFs can be approved via general revenue while a SANS is in process. Let me see, I don't remember my last, I'll go for summary. The goal of the individual in the service delivery system is for those they support to be funded properly and achieve their goals. SANS are a process that APD created. Providers, families, and individuals in WSC need to work together for a successful process on that. It's critically important. The better community have,